Well, I am here at the Forum on Central Banking. You know, we've got that blockbuster panel tomorrow from all the central bankers. Today, as you were saying, we're going to hear from Mario Draghi. But last night, at the opening dinner, there was what was described as a provocation from Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary. Larry, thank you very much for joining us. You know, what was your provocation? That the central bankers and the world generally are just not... They think the global economy's gone back to normal, and it just hasn't.
Exactly, Stephanie. The issue that's preoccupied monetary policy for the generation before the financial crisis, the avoidance of inflation, is no longer the top issue. The top issue, I believe, is the maintenance of sound growth and getting to full employment. And that's going to be a much more difficult challenge over the next generation than many suppose, because of the very sharp declines we've seen around the world in the neutral real interest rate. Declines that in many cases have been masked by the very substantial fiscal expansions we've seen.
I mean, you obviously are known for having popularised the fear of secular stagnation. I mean, in a sense, you know, some people have thought that you'd walked away from that a little bit over the last few years, but I felt like you were sort of doubling down on it last night.
No, I think that's exactly right. Some people think that, well, the economies are growing. That shows that the secular stagnation theory was wrong. I have exactly the opposite view. It required enormous fiscal stimulus to get the economies to grow even reasonably adequately, and that demonstrates the validity of the secular stagnation thesis. Relative to what happened in 2013, when I first talked about secular stagnation, take the United States. You've had far more fiscal expansion than we had then. You have lower long-term interest rates than we had then. We have asset prices that have increased in an unsustainable way. And so it's not that the economy has somehow healed itself. It's that the set of developments predicted by secular stagnation theory have happened. And yet many make the mistake of condemning those developments as somehow inappropriate because they represent abnormal monetary policies or excessively expansionary fiscal policies.
And many in the US, though, would say, well, but we're looking now at wage growth. Yes, it's taken a long time, but we're starting to see some signs of acceleration in wages. We're still very loose monetary policy. You know, give it some time. You're overstating the problem.
Well, those who put it the way you just did neglect that we've seen an enormous fiscal expansion and an enormous prospective fiscal expansion. They neglect that asset prices have risen, creating a wealth effect at a pace that asset prices will surely not continue to rise. We're not going to see 15, 20% every year increases in the stock market. So, yes, it may be that if policy stays on guard with relatively expansionary monetary policies, with fiscal policies that are traditionally regarded as imprudent, then we may keep this going for a while. But we're living with a very brittle economy because, you know, downturns happen. The odds of the economy moving into a downturn are about 20% each year. And when they happen, the normal playbook is to cut interest rates by 500 basis points. And there's not going to be that kind of room going forward.
Well, you precisely, and you say that the world is less prepared economically, socially, politically for a downturn than it's ever been, and yet you're worried that people don't have that firmly enough in mind. I mean, I figure that most central bankers are pretty determined to avoid the next downturn.
Well, one hopes that they will be, but at the margin, there's a question: are you going to guard against increases in inflation above 2%, or are you going to guard against the possibility of a downturn? And the latter, a downturn, seems to me cataclysmic in the current environment in its economic implications, because we'll have such difficulty responding, and in its political implications, given the rises of populism. And so it seems to me that we need to be tilted very much against that risk, even at some risk that inflation could rise above 2%.
You're you're thought of as a pretty strong critic of the Trump administration. You were a fierce critic of the tax plan that was passed, but you have pointed to fiscal stimulus, the support that the economy's had, as something which has offset secular stagnation, is still offsetting secular stagnation. Does that mean you kind of support the broad thrust of President Trump's fiscal policy?
No. The primary problem, as I've always emphasized with the tax cut, is that it was designed to provide neither supply side nor demand side stimulus. Not supply side because it primarily focused on reducing profits that corporations had earned from their monopoly power or from their past investment. Not on the demand side because the benefits were flowing to those who were already most liquid and had the largest level of resources and were therefore least likely to engage in extra spending.
Do you think, I mean, I'm going to be sitting on this panel tomorrow trying to keep in check the four central bank governors, including the head of the ECB and the Fed and the Bank of Japan. They are all going at different speeds, but very slowly on the way to more normal monetary policies. You would say even the pace that we're thinking about now that markets are anticipating is too fast, that runs a risk. All of them moving together runs a risk of bringing us back to where we were?
I think as a general proposition, they're holding out the prospect of somewhat more monetary tightening than markets are actually expecting. And I think markets are more right. And I'm not going to get into the business of predicting what central banks will actually do. The thesis of my remarks is that they need to be prepared to balance risks very much in favor of avoiding recession. And indeed, they need to act as if they have at least a dual mandate, with the other part of the mandate emphasizing maximizing employment and growth.
When you listen to them talk, I mean, Jay Powell in his press conference last week was talking a lot about how good it was for the economy to have the kind of tight labour market that we have now. You wouldn't say the kind of communications we're hearing them suggest that they do have that kind of concern?
I think you pick up substantial concern in the United States about the Phillips curve and inflation, as well as picking up concern about maintaining the momentum of output. But yes, I have not been shy at certain points about being a sharp critic of central bank policy, but I think in response to necessity, central banks have tended to move towards a posture of recognizing the secular stagnation threat and being prepared to keep interest rates low. They just need to be prepared to stick with it and not confuse the results of successful policy with the lack of need for strong policy.
Jay Powell said that he was going to de-emphasize, or he suggested he was going to de-emphasize the unobservables, these concepts like the neutral rate, or particularly the natural rate of unemployment in policy going forward. Do you think natural rate of unemployment has any meaning in the world that you describe?
Jay Powell, I think, got it just right when he applied that notion to the natural rate of unemployment. It's what I've been saying for several years, that the Phillips curve is a highly unpredictable and irregular relationship. Rather than relying on it, we need to not respond to inflation threats until we see the whites of their eyes. And we need to wait and focus on the inflation data rather than extrapolations from models in making monetary policy. I think the neutral real rate is a different concept, because that's like, where's the beginning of your tape measure? You've got to know where you are or make a judgment about where you are before you can judge monetary policy. And so we don't really have the luxury of simply dismissing the concept. And I think it's much better to make the best guess we have than to simply assume, as some do, that the neutral real rate of interest is a constant.
You say the absolute big, we're going to run out of time in a minute, but you say the biggest risk to the global economy at the moment is, or the biggest priority is avoiding the next downturn. Most downturns historically have happened from a policy error, often a central bank policy error. Do you think that is more likely this time, or is the trade war starting to give you concern on that?
Trade war is not likely to be large enough that its direct effects damage the economy, but it's profoundly. But its psychological effects, its effects in increasing uncertainty, could be very serious. And we're certainly getting later in a cycle of escalation. We've still got a long way to go before this is some kind of full-fledged trade war that would send the global economy into recession, but we've moved down the escalatory step.
When you listen to President Trump or candidate Trump and you heard what him saying about what he wanted to do with trade, a lot of people thought, well, he's not going to be serious. He's not really going to push forward. You know, where we are now, how does that compare with how far you thought he might go in office?
He has fallen short of even my low expectations. There was the defense, famously, that he should be taken seriously but not literally. Alas, there's increasing evidence, both in his acts of, I use this word carefully, hate towards disadvantaged groups in the United States, turning us into a country that imprisons children separately from their parents, and his actions on trade, that he actually means and intends to do many of the things he talked about in his campaign, and that has to be something very alarming for anyone who believes in traditional American values.